Echoes in the dark. David's house was one of those classic two-story American homes, sitting quietly on the outskirts of a sleepy town in upstate New York. The house had an eerie charm, old but well-kept, with a creaky wooden porch and ivy crawling up the sides. It was the kind of place that looked picturesque during the day but had a different, almost sinister vibe when night fell. David lived there with his sister, Emily. It was a mother-daughter style house, meaning there were two separate living spaces, one on each floor, each with its own kitchen, living room, and bedroom. Emily took the downstairs while David claimed the upper floor. Emily wasn't home much. She spent most nights at her boyfriend's place, about 20 miles away, leaving David alone in the big, empty house. At 30, he was used to being on his own, and he liked to think he wasn't the kind of guy who got scared easily. But sometimes, just sometimes, the isolation got to him, especially late at night, when shadows seemed to stretch a little longer, and every creak of the house felt like someone or something was watching him. This particular night, David was alone again. Emily had texted earlier, saying she wouldn't be home, so he had the place to himself. He decided to make the most of it by watching a horror movie in the living room. The upstairs space had an open layout, with the living room, dining room, and kitchen all blending into one large area. David's couch was in the middle of the room, positioned so that his back was to a vast, dark expanse of the house. It wasn't the most comfortable setup for watching a scary movie. David didn't mind, or at least he told himself that. As the movie played on, the room was bathed in the flickering light from the TV, the only source of illumination in the otherwise pitch-black space. David found himself glancing over his shoulder more often than he cared to admit. Each time he'd catch sight of nothing but darkness behind him. Yet the feeling of being watched persisted. The movie wasn't even that scary, he reasoned. So why did he feel so uneasy? When the credits finally rolled, David let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He shut off the TV, casting the room into complete darkness, and made his way to the bathroom to brush his teeth. The house was eerily silent, the only sound being the faint hum of the fridge downstairs. After finishing up, David turned off all the lights and headed to bed. He fell asleep quickly, the weariness from a long day overtaking any lingering anxiety from the movie. But his sleep didn't last long. He woke with a start a couple of hours later, the digital clock on his nightstand glowing 1:03 a.m. He wasn't sure what had woken him, but he felt disoriented, the remnants of a dream fading away too quickly to grasp. As he lay there, trying to make sense of the sudden wakefulness, he heard it, his sister's voice. David. The voice was muffled but unmistakable. It was Emily calling out to him from downstairs. David blinked, his mind still foggy with sleep. What was she doing here? She'd said she wasn't coming home tonight, and why was she yelling? Was something wrong? He sat up in bed, listening intently. The house was silent again, but he could have sworn he'd heard her. Maybe she was arguing with her boyfriend and had come back to the house without him noticing. He got out of bed and made his way to the hallway, the darkness pressing in on him from all sides. He fumbled for the light switch, finally flicking it on, and the dim bulb overhead cast a weak yellowish glow down the narrow hall. "Emily?" David called, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet house. No response. Just as he was about to turn back, he heard her again, this time clearer and more insistent. "David, down here!" Her voice was coming from downstairs, from her part of the house. David felt a chill run down his spine. Something about this didn't feel right, but he couldn't just ignore her. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each creak of the old wooden steps echoing ominously in the silence. As he descended, the darkness seemed to grow thicker, almost palpable, as if the shadows themselves were alive. At the bottom of the stairs, he paused, trying to remember where the light switch was in the foyer. His hand brushed against the wall, searching for the switch, but he couldn't find it. His heart was pounding in his chest, cold sweat forming on his brow. "Emily?" Called again, but there was no answer this time. He stepped into the small hallway that led to her kitchen, finally finding the light switch and flicking it on. The bulb sputtered to life, casting a weak, flickering light across the room. The kitchen was empty, and the silence was deafening. "Emily?" David's voice trembled slightly as he called out again. No response. He walked through the kitchen into her living room, the dim light from the kitchen barely reaching the far corners of the room. It was empty, too. His sister's belongings were there. Her favorite blanket draped over the back of the couch, her coffee mug sitting on the table, but there was no sign of her. David's unease grew stronger. He checked her bedroom, but it was just as empty. The bed was neatly made, nothing out of place. He called her name one last time, louder now, the sound echoing through the empty rooms. And then, just as the silence began to settle in again, he heard it. A soft thud, like something had fallen to the floor, coming from her bedroom, the same room he'd just checked and found empty. David's blood ran cold. He backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to get out, to run back upstairs and lock the door. But his legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. Forcing himself to move, he turned and bolted up the stairs, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst out of his chest. He stumbled into his bedroom, slamming the door shut behind him. His phone was on the nightstand, and with trembling hands, he grabbed it and dialed Emily's number. The line rang once, twice, 3 times before going to voicemail. He tried again and again, but each time there was no answer. David sat on the edge of his bed, phone clutched in his hand, trying to convince himself that he had imagined it all. He was groggy, half asleep, probably just hearing things. But the memory of his sister's voice, so clear and so desperate, refused to fade. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and he fell into a fitful sleep, haunted by fragmented dreams of dark, empty rooms and echoes of his sister's voice calling to him from the shadows. The next morning, David was jolted awake by the sound of his phone buzzing. It was a text from Emily, asking why he'd called her so many times in the middle of the night. His stomach twisted as he read the message. He quickly replied, asking if she had come home last night. Her response came almost immediately. No, I stayed at Sam's place all night. Why? David's heart sank. He got up, hesitating for a moment before heading downstairs to Emily's bedroom. The room was exactly as he'd left it, neatly made bed, nothing out of place. He searched the floor, looking for anything that might have made the sound he'd heard the night before. But there was nothing. No fallen object, no sign that anyone had been there. A cold dread settled over him as he realized the implications. He wanted to believe that it had all been a dream, trick of his tired mind. But deep down, he knew that something far more sinister had happened. The voice he'd heard, the sounds in the empty room, they were too vivid, too real to be mere hallucinations. David spent the day in a fog, going through the motions of his routine but unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every creak of the house sent shivers down his spine. He tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that it was just his mind playing tricks on him. But the unease only grew as the day wore on. That night, David was determined not to be caught off guard again. He kept the lights on in every room, double-checked the locks on the doors, and even considered calling a friend to stay over. But in the end, he decided against it, not wanting to seem paranoid. He settled onto the couch with a book, trying to distract himself from the creeping dread that had taken hold of him. Hours passed, and the house remained silent. The clock ticked past midnight, and David felt a small sense of relief. Maybe it had all been in his head. Maybe he was just tired and stressed, and his mind had conjured up something that wasn't there. But then, just as he was beginning to relax, the lights in the house flickered. Once, twice, then went out completely, plunging the house into darkness. David's breath caught in his throat. He reached for his phone, but before he could turn on the flashlight, he heard it again. David? It was his sister's voice, but this time it was different. It was distorted, as if coming from a great distance or through water. The sound sent chills down his spine, and he felt a cold sweat break out across his skin. David, help me. The voice was closer now, coming from the hallway. David stood frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew he should move, should do something, but his body refused to obey. David? The voice was right outside the living room door, and then the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately. David backed away, his mind racing. He had to get out, had to run, but his legs felt like lead. The door creaked open, and in the darkness, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was his sister, or at least it looked like her. But there was something wrong, something horribly wrong. Her eyes were too dark, her skin too pale, and her movements were jerky, unnatural. "David, help me." The voice was a hollow, echoing mockery of his sister's, and as the figure stepped into the room, David could see that it wasn't his sister at all. It was something else, something wearing her face like a mask. He stumbled back, his foot catching on the edge of the coffee table, and he fell hard onto the floor. The figure moved closer, its limbs twitching and contorting in unnatural ways. "David." It reached out a hand, the fingers long and thin, almost skeletal. David scrambled backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He had to get away, had to get out of the house, but the thing was closing in on him, its eyes, those dark, empty eyes, boring into his soul. Just as the figure was about to touch him, the lights in the house flickered back on. The room was empty. The door was closed. There was no sign of the figure, no sign that anything had been there at all. David lay on the floor, trembling, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Had it been another hallucination? A dream? But it had felt so real, so terrifyingly real. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat on the couch, every light in the house blazing, his eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, waiting for the figure to return. But the house remained silent. The next morning, David called Emily. He needed to hear her voice, needed to know she was okay. She answered on the second ring, sounding groggy but otherwise fine. "David, what's going on? You sound weird." "Emily, are you sure you didn't come home last night?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "No, I told you. I stayed at Sam's." "Why? Did something happen?" David hesitated, unsure of how to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. I thought I heard you. I thought you were here." Another pause, longer this time. "David, are you okay? You don't sound like yourself." He swallowed, forcing himself to stay calm. "I'm fine. I must have been dreaming." Emily didn't sound convinced, but she let it go. "Okay, well, I'll be home later today. Maybe we can talk then?" "Yeah," David said, his voice hollow. "Maybe." That evening, Emily returned home. David was relieved to see her, but the relief was short-lived. As they sat together in the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Emily seemed fine, but there was an undercurrent of tension between them, a silent acknowledgement of something neither of them wanted to discuss. Finally, David broke the silence. "Emily, has anything strange happened to you here? Anything you can't explain?" Emily looked at him, her expression guarded. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," David said, running a hand through his hair. I've been hearing things, seeing things. I thought I heard you last night, but you weren't here. And then there was this figure." Emily's eyes widened, but she didn't say anything. David pressed on, the words tumbling out of him in a rush. "It looked like you, but it wasn't you. It was something else, something wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt so real." Emily was silent for a long time, her gaze fixed on the floor. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "David, there's something I need to tell you." David's heart skipped a beat. "What is it?" Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "I've been seeing things too, hearing things. It started a few weeks ago, but I didn't want to say anything because I thought I was going crazy. But now I think there's something wrong with this house." David felt a cold shiver run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "I don't know," Emily said, her voice trembling. "But whatever it is, it's getting worse. I feel like it's watching us, like it's waiting for something." David's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was saying. Could it be possible? Could the house be haunted, or cursed, or something even worse? As they sat there in the growing darkness, the shadows seemed to close in around them, pressing down on them from all sides. The sense of dread was overwhelming, and David knew, deep down, that they were no longer alone. The days that followed were a blur of fear and paranoia. David and Emily tried to go about their lives as normally as possible. The sense of unease never left them. The house felt different, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. They heard whispers in the night, footsteps in empty rooms, and saw fleeting glimpses of shadowy figures out of the corners of their eyes. The thing that had appeared to David that night never showed itself again, but its presence was always there, lurking just out of sight. David knew it was only a matter of time before it came back, before it tried to take them. One night, as the wind howled outside and the house groaned under the weight of the storm, David and Emily made a decision. They couldn't stay there any longer. They had to leave, to get as far away from the house as possible. They packed their bags in a hurry, barely speaking to each other, the fear driving them to move as quickly as possible. As they reached the front door, ready to make their escape, the lights in the house flickered once more, then went out completely. In the darkness, David heard it again. His sister's voice, distorted and hollow, echoing through the house. "David, help me." He turned to Emily, but she was frozen in place, her eyes wide with terror. The voice came again, closer this time. "David." And then the figure appeared in the doorway, just as it had before. But this time there were more of them. Shadowy, twisted figures, all wearing the faces of people David knew, people who were long gone. They reached out for him, their hands cold and clammy, their eyes empty voids. David felt a scream rising in his throat, but no sound came out. The figures closed in, their touch freezing to the core. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The lights flickered back on and the figures were gone. David was standing in the foyer, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Emily was beside him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "David, we have to go. Now." David nodded, unable to speak, and they ran out of the house into the pouring rain. They didn't stop until they were far away, the house a distant shadow on the horizon. David and Emily never returned to that house. They left it behind, along with the nightmares that had plagued them there. They moved to a new town, a new home, trying to put the past behind them. The memories lingered, haunting them in the dark corners of their minds. And sometimes, late at night, David would wake up in a cold sweat, the echoes of his sister's voice still ringing in his ears, calling to him from the darkness. "David, help me." The Visitor. When I was 14, I spent a lot of nights alone. My mom worked as a nurse at the local hospital, and her shifts often stretched into the late hours of the night. My older brother, who had been my protector, left for college a few months before, leaving me to fend for myself. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood in New England, where the nights were long, dark, and eerily silent. That particular Saturday night felt like any other. My mom had left for her shift around 6 p.m., reminding me to lock all the doors and windows. "Don't open the door for anyone, no matter what," she said before she left. I rolled my eyes but nodded. It was the usual drill. After she left, I invited Molly over. We were sort of seeing each other at the time, awkward teenage romance and all that. We hung out in the living room, watching horror movies on Netflix and eating microwave popcorn. Molly wasn't a fan of scary movies, but I convinced her to watch one with me. The tension in the film made her cling to me, which, at 14, I thought was pretty cool. By 11 p.m., Molly had to go home. Her parents were strict about curfew, and I didn't want to get her in trouble. We said our goodbyes at the front door, and I watched her walk down the street until she disappeared around the corner. That's when the house felt bigger, emptier. The silence was thick, almost suffocating. The kind that makes you aware of every creak and groan the house makes. I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling myself it was just the remnants of the horror movie we'd watched. I turned on the TV in my room, hoping some late-night comedy would drown out the lingering fear. My room was upstairs, and my bed was next to the window that overlooked our backyard. I liked it that way, being able to look out and see the stars. Tonight, the darkness outside seemed oppressive. I was halfway through an episode of some mindless sitcom when I heard it. Faint scraping noise coming from the backyard. I froze, my eyes darting towards the window. My first thought was that it was just the wind, or maybe a stray cat. But the sound persisted, a slow, deliberate dragging that sent shivers down my spine. I got up, my heart pounding in my chest, and crept towards the window. Peering out into the darkness, I scanned the backyard, which was dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the deck. And then I saw it. Figure sitting on one of the deck chairs, motionless. My first instinct was to call out Molly's name, thinking she might have forgotten something and come back. But as the figure slowly raised its head to look up at me, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach that it wasn't her. It was a man. His face was obscured by shadows. I could tell he was staring straight at me. Cold, primal fear gripped me. I quickly ducked down, hiding below the windowsill. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. I told myself it had to be a neighbor or maybe someone who wandered into our yard by mistake. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. I pulled out my phone and texted a few friends in our group chat, asking if one of them was playing a prank on me. The responses came quickly. Know why? What's going on? Are you okay? I didn't reply. My hands were trembling too much. I glanced back at the window, fighting the urge to peek out again. I wanted to believe it was just some harmless prank. Something in my gut told me otherwise. After what felt like an eternity, I mustered the courage to peek out the window again. The man was still there, sitting in the same position, but now he was looking directly up at my window. The dim light cast eerie shadows across his face, making it hard to make out any details. But I could see his eyes, two dark pits that seemed to swallow the light around them. Panic surged through me. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into silence. I didn't want him to know I was still there. Curled up on my bed, hugging my knees to my chest. The only sound was the pounding of my heart in my ears. I didn't dare turn on my phone again, afraid that even the faint glow of the screen would give me away. Minutes dragged by. Fear was suffocating, paralyzing me. I kept telling myself that he would leave, that he couldn't just sit there all night. But when I finally gathered the courage to look out the window again, he was still there. This time he wasn't just sitting. He was laughing. At first, it was silent, just his shoulders shaking as if he were convulsing with laughter. Then slowly, the sound began to creep through the night. A wheezing, gasping noise that sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the kind of laugh that came from joy. It was something else, something darker. I felt sick. My stomach churned, and I had to fight the urge to vomit. The sound of his laughter seemed to fill the room, growing louder and more distorted, like a bad dream that you can't wake up from. I wanted to scream at him to go away, to leave me alone. The words stuck in my throat. All I could do was watch in horror as he continued to laugh, his head thrown back, eyes fixed on my window. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The man lowered his head and just sat there, motionless once again. Couldn't take it anymore. I backed away from the window, trying to think of what to do. I knew I should call the police, but I was terrified that the moment I moved, he would do something, try to break in, or worse. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage with a predator lurking just outside. I don't know how long I sat there, huddled on my bed, too afraid to move. Time seemed to stretch out, each second feeling like an hour. My mind raced with thoughts of what could happen, each one worse than the last. Then I heard it, the sound of the back door creaking open. My blood turned to ice. I knew I had locked it, but the sound was unmistakable. He was in the house. I bolted up from my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I stood frozen in the middle of my room, listening to the faint sound of footsteps moving through the house. They were slow, deliberate, as if he were savoring each step. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there and wait for him to find me. I grabbed my phone and tiptoed to my bedroom door, trying to be as quiet as possible. My hand was shaking so badly that I almost dropped the phone. Footsteps grew closer, echoing up the staircase. He was coming. I crept out of my room and down the hallway, towards the stairs. The only light came from the moon shining through the windows, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. I could hear him now, breathing heavily as he made his way up the stairs. There was no time to think. I ran to the top of the stairs and peered down, hoping to see something, anything that would tell me where he was. But the darkness below was impenetrable. All I could hear was the slow, steady creak of the stairs as he climbed. I was trapped. The only way out was down the stairs, but that's where he was. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. Then an idea came to me. I turned and ran back to my room, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. I threw open the window and looked down. It was a long drop to the ground. but I had no choice. I couldn't stay in the house with him. I climbed out onto the ledge, my hands gripping the sides of the window frame. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I swung my legs over the edge and dangled there for a moment, trying to gather the courage to let go. The sound of the door creaking open behind me made the decision for me. I let go. The fall seemed to last forever, but it ended with a painful thud. I hit the ground, gasped in pain, feeling the jolt shoot up my legs and through my spine. But I couldn't stop. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the sharp pain in my ankle, and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I had to get as far away from the house as possible. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent. I ran until my lungs burned and I could feel my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I stopped, collapsing onto the sidewalk, gasping for breath. My mind was spinning, a chaotic whirl of fear and panic. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking so badly that I could barely press the button. When the operator answered, I could barely get the words out. There's someone in my house. Please send help. I gave them my address and then sat there, trembling, waiting for the sound of sirens. Police arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. When they got to the house, they searched every room, every corner, but the man was gone. They found the back door ajar, the lock broken. There was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. They questioned me for hours, trying to get a description of the man. But I couldn't give them much. His face was always in shadow, its features blurred by the darkness. All I could remember were his eyes, those dark, soulless pits, and his laughter. My mom came home early from her shift, frantic and angry. She couldn't believe I hadn't called her sooner, that I hadn't called 911 the moment I saw the man in the backyard. I tried to explain, but the words just wouldn't come. The fear had paralyzed me, made me stupid. The police stayed for the rest of the night, patrolling the area, but they never found him. They told us it was probably just a drifter, someone looking for an easy target. But I knew it was more than that. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep. Every night, I would lie in bed, staring at the window, waiting for the sound of scraping, waiting for those eyes to appear in the darkness. He never came back. Even as I grew older, the memory of that night never left me. It haunted my dreams, turned every shadow into a threat, every creak into a warning. I never told anyone the full story. Not my mom, not even Molly. I didn't want to relive it. But the fear stayed with me, constant reminder of that night. I could never shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere, waiting. And every time I heard a laugh in the distance, my blood would run cold, and I would remember those dark, soulless eyes staring up at me from the darkness. Because deep down, I knew that he wasn't just a drifter. He wasn't just some random stranger who stumbled into my yard. He was something else, something evil. And one day, I fear he'll come back. Years later, when I had finally moved out of that house and started a new life, I received a letter. There was no return address, no name, just a single sheet of paper folded neatly inside. I unfolded it with trembling hands, my heart pounding as I read the words scrawled across the page in jagged, uneven letters. I'm still watching. That night, the nightmares returned. And this time, I knew they weren't just dreams. The shadows of Maple Street. Maple Street was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. It was the kind of town where neighbors chatted over fences and kids played in the street until the sun went down. But on that Friday night, the ordinary mask of Maple Street was ripped away, revealing something far more sinister. I was 10 years old that night, youngest of 3 siblings. My older brother Alex was 14, and my little sister, Lily, was just 5. That night started like any other. My parents were out, rushing to the hospital because of a phone call that shattered our peace. Alex had been hit by a car while out with his friends, and though he wasn't in immediate danger, his leg was broken badly. My parents were frantic, and I could feel their fear like a thick fog in our house. I was in my room, playing my Star Wars video game, completely oblivious to the chaos unfolding downstairs. The game was my escape. Galaxy far, far away where I could be a hero without real consequence. That illusion was shattered when I heard my mom's sobs. The cries were raw, filled with a desperation that made my stomach churn. I scrambled out of my room to see what was wrong, but I was met with the sight of my mom, hunched over the phone, her face a mask of worry. "Please, just tell me he's okay," she cried into the receiver. I wanted to rush to her, offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I stood there, frozen, until my dad came running up the stairs. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a matter of moments. He put a hand on my mom's shoulder and said, "We need to go. They're waiting for us." As they hurried to grab their coats and wake Lily, my dad glanced at me and asked, "Can you stay here by yourself, buddy?" "I'll be okay," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. My parents hurried out of the house, and I was left alone, a child abandoned in the safety of the ordinary, now tinged with a sense of dread. House, once a haven, now felt like a cage. The comfort of my room, now a prison. For hours I sat alone, playing the Star Wars game to distract myself. The sound of the blaster fire and lightsabers clashing was a poor substitute for the laughter and chatter of my family. Clock ticked louder with every passing minute, rhythm a constant reminder of my solitude. It was well past midnight when I heard the front door creak open. My heart raced. I had turned off the TV and the PlayStation, trying to pretend that I was asleep. I pulled my Game Boy from beneath the covers and tried to focus on the tiny screen, but my mind was elsewhere. The silence downstairs stretched on, and I began to feel uneasy. My parents should have been back by now. I crept to my bedroom door and pressed my ear against it, straining to hear any familiar voices. There was nothing but an eerie silence. I slowly opened the door and peeked out. The hallway was dark, and the only light came from the faint glow of the street lamp outside, filtering through the windows. The living room below was pitch black, save for a faint moonlight that barely illuminated the room. 3 figures stood in the middle of the living room, their shapes looming and indistinct. They weren't my family. Panic surged through me. My breath caught in my throat as I silently retreated back into my room, closing the door with painstaking care. The click of the latch seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness. I scrambled into the closet, pushing aside boxes and old clothes to create a small hiding spot. My heart pounded in my ears as I sat huddled behind the piles, praying that I wouldn't be found. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The sound of footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder and more deliberate. The footsteps came up the stairs, and my worst fears were realized when they reached my door. I held my breath, fear almost suffocating. Bedroom door creaked open, and I heard the footsteps move towards my bed. The sound of the bed covers rustling was almost unbearable. Then there was silence, followed by the slow, deliberate approach towards my closet. I sat in the darkness, shaking. Closet door creaked open, and I knew I was exposed. I didn't dare to move or make a sound. The door stayed open for what felt like an eternity. I could feel the breath of whoever was in the room. I couldn't see them. My body was rigid with fear, my mind racing with thoughts of what might happen. Finally, closet door closed, and the footsteps retreated from the room. The silence was oppressive. I stayed hidden for what felt like an age before I dared to move. My limbs felt numb as I carefully peered out from behind the boxes. The room was empty. The sense of dread lingered. I waited another hour, my nerves frayed. When I finally heard the sound of my parents' voices downstairs, I raced down, nearly tripping over my own feet. The front door was ajar, the lock obviously not secured in their rush. My parents were disheveled and exhausted. They looked around the house in shock. "They've stolen everything," my mom cried out, her voice cracking with distress. I was too stunned to speak. The living room was in disarray, with drawers pulled open and valuables missing. It wasn't just the theft that had rattled me. It was the realization of how close I had come to being discovered. My father hugged me tightly, his relief evident. "Are you okay? Did they hurt you?" His voice trembled with concern. I'm fine," stammered. I just hid in the closet. They exchanged a worried glance. "We should have been more careful," my dad said, more to himself than to anyone else. "We should have locked the door." The police came later, and the house was scoured for fingerprints. But the intruders had left no trace. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, leaving only the shroud of fear behind them. The nights that followed were filled with nightmares. The shadows in my room seemed darker and the silence more oppressive. I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, the memory of those shadowy figures haunting me. In the end, we were left with questions and fears that would never fully be answered. Why did they come? What would have happened if I had been found? Did they see me hiding in the closet, or was it sheer luck that kept me safe? As I grew older, the terror of that night faded into the background, but it never truly left me. Maple Street returned to its usual routine, but I knew that beneath its placid surface there were shadows waiting to emerge. And every now and then, when the night was still and the darkness seemed too close, I would remember that Friday night and wonder if the shadows of Maple Street had ever truly gone away.